People often remember Josiah Henson as the kind and long-suffering Uncle Tom, a sign of quiet strength. But what if the truth about his life, the real man behind the legend, was much more complicated and had to make hard choices? Painful enough to haunt a soul forever? What if the story we know is just a carefully planned front, hiding a past full of moral terror and a secret burden that few people could ever understand? The story of Josiah Henson is not one of simple virtue, but of a man who was stuck in. A man who had to make impossible choices and walk a tightrope between survival and betrayal while keeping a secret. That could destroy the picture history has painted of him. Before we go on with Josiah's story, Henson, a story made up of bits of history and scary thoughts about what could have happened, please take a moment to sign up for Liturgy of Fear. Hit that bell so you don't miss it. Let us know in the comments below if you missed our next trip into the shadows of the past. What state or city are you from, listening to this disturbing part of American history? Your involvement helps us find more truths that have been lost. The year 1789 began with a weak promise. For some, it was a new beginning, but for others, it was just the same old thing, of a nightmare that has been passed down. On the huge tobacco-filled land of Francis Newman in Charles County, Maryland, Josiah was born into slavery. He didn't remember his mother's soft lullabies as a child, the sharp, guttural screams that cut through the humid air, the metallic taste of blood, and the acrid smell of fear. He, his father, a very strong and brave man, had his ear cut off when he was barely old enough to walk, daring to protect his wife from an attack by a white overseer. The picture of his father, bleeding, broken, and still fighting, burned into Josiah's young mind, a silent reminder of how hard life was, of their lives. His father was sold to the South not long after, and he disappeared into the depths of the cotton fields, leaving behind a hole that no child should ever have to see. Millie was his mother, carried the weight of this trauma like a blanket. Her spirit, which used to be bright, dimmed with each year that goes by. Her eyes were always sad, and Josiah learned to read them as the silent language of their people. She taught him how the earth moves, the secrets of the forest, and how to live with quiet dignity. Also, the constant threat that lay just below the surface of every calm day. There was a plantation called Newman, a small part of the South where people were worth money and the crack of the whip was as common as. The sun beat down on fields of tobacco and corn, which were watered by the sweat of the crickets, and the tears of men and women who were slaves. As Josiah got older, he got stronger and more athletic, without a doubt. He was tall, strong, and had an intelligence that shone in his eyes. He quickly set himself apart. Isaac Riley, Francis Newman's son-in-law, got some of the. Josiah, who was still a young man at the time, was moved to his service. Riley is a man, of changing fortunes and a temper that was as unpredictable as the weather in Maryland, soon realized. Josiah's skills. Josiah had a sharp mind, unlike many of his peers. For management, a natural understanding of farming, and a surprising ability to read and write that was secretly taught to. A kind-hearted white boy on a nearby farm taught him this. These skills are rare and valuable to the slaves, which made him stand out. This one-of-a-kind mix of. His rise was due to his strength, intelligence, and the fact that people thought he was loyal. Hay Riley made a choice as debts piled up and his interest in the daily grind of plantation management waned. That would change Josiah's fate forever and cast a long, dark shadow over his spirit. He made Josiah his overseer or superintendent, as Riley liked to call it that instead of the other enslaved people. The promotion was. A two-edged sword, a poisoned cup, offered with a fake smile. On the one hand, it gave Josiah rights that no one else could have imagined. Better food, a little better clothes, a small cabin for his growing family, and his wife, whom he loved, Charlotte, and their kids. He got a break from the hard work in the fields and a chance to protect his own from the worst kinds of cruelty. But on the other hand, it put him in a moral quagmire that he couldn't get out of, that there was no way out of. He was now the go-between for the master's unpredictable will and the pain of his own people. He was given the whip to use on people he called kin, not on himself. Those who were also in chains with him, who were from the same background as him, and who prayed silently for freedom. The psychological intricacy of this job was a pain that ate away at him. He was a slave, but he was in charge of other enslaved men and women. It was his job to follow the master's rules and drive, to keep order, to punish people, and to make things. The other slaves looked at him with a mix of awe, anger, and fear. Fear, awe, and anger. Some people saw him as a shield against Riley's worst urges. Some people thought of him as a collaborator, a tool of their oppression, and a man who had traded his for a few pieces of comfort. Every day, Josiah walked a tightrope. He learned how to deal with the dangerous waters of plantation politics, how to guess Riley's moods, and how to calm the hit where he could and be harsh when he needed to. He came up with a plan that was terrifyingly effective. He often punished people himself, but he did it with careful restraint to make sure the blows hurt enough to meet Riley's demands for discipline, but never so harsh that it hurt or killed someone for good. He became a master of the performance, a silent actor in a brutal play. His face, he wore a stern mask of authority, but his heart was a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. The smell of tobacco leaves drying in the barns made the air on the Riley plantation thick. Freshly turned dirt and the smell of fear that was always there. The sounds were a constant symphony of oppression, the far-off sound of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle, and the rhythmic thud of hoes in the fields and the occasional sharp crack of a whip, which Riley sometimes used himself. Josiah did it sometimes. Every morning brought with it the fear of the unknown, the tiredness of every sunset. Another day has passed. Josiah's cabin was a little bigger, but it still felt like a cage. His whispers. At night, the soft rustle of Charlotte next to him and the sound of children playing were his only comfort and his biggest weakness. He knew for sure that his job and his family's safety depended entirely on his ability to keep up this impossible act. The moral tension was always there, like a constant, suffocating presence. Presence, a silent scream stuck in his chest, waiting for the moment it would inevitably come out. The summer of 1818 in Maryland was hot and humid, brought with it a suffocating stillness, a prelude to the storm that would forever scar Josiah's conscience. The tobacco crop had been small, and Riley's debts, which were always there, had grown into a huge never-ending problem. Monster. There were a lot of unspoken worries in the air on the plantation. The people who were enslaved moved with a greater sense of dread, knowing that their master's financial problems often meant harsh results for them, rumors of sales and families breaking up. Snaked through the cabins like poisonous snakes. During this tense time, a young man named Daniel. He was known for his fiery spirit and his quiet defiance, so he did something desperate. Daniel. He had a wife named Esther and a baby son named Jacob. The thought of losing them had pushed him to the edge. On a night without a moon, Daniel and two other young men Caleb and Samuel tried to run away. Their plan, which was quickly thought up and poorly carried out, was doomed from the start. Thought up and poorly carried out, it was doomed from the start. A group of slave catchers caught them, hired by a planter who lived nearby. Their escape was stopped before they even crossed the county line. The news came to the Riley plantation like a bolt of lightning. Riley's face was twisted in a mix of anger and money panic, called Josiah right away. "Henson!" he yelled. His voice echoed through the main house. "They caught Daniel and his friends. They're being held at the Miller farm. Go get them back and show them what happens to people who disobey." This plantation understands the cost of defiance. Josiah felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He knew Daniel, a proud and stubborn young man who had often questioned Josiah's authority and his compromises. He knew Esther, Daniel's wife, who was quiet, a religious woman whose eyes now showed the same fear as Millie's. And he knew Jacob, a little, innocent boy, whose future was now in danger. Riley gave Josiah a heavy braided leather whip with stiff, new thongs. "Henson, make sure they don't forget this. Make sure that everyone remembers." When Josiah took the whip, his hands shook. The weight of it felt like 1,000 sins. He rode to the Miller's farm, where it was quiet. The only sounds during the trip were the steady thud of the horse's hooves and the frantic pounding of his own heart. His mind was racing with a storm of conflicting ideas. He could say no, but what happens next? Riley's wrath would be quick and unforgiving, not just for him, but also for Charlotte and their kids. He could give a small punishment, but Riley would see through it, and the results would be bad. He could obey orders, but what would that cost him? Soul. Daniel, Caleb, and Samuel were already tied up when he got there. Their faces were bruised and swollen, and their eyes were defiant but full of a desperate plea. Esther stood nearby, holding baby Jacob and crying silently. Josiah's heart. The other slaves on the Miller farm watched with a mix of fear and morbid curiosity on their faces, wanting to know. Josiah and Daniel's eyes met. Josiah saw what Daniel was looking at, not just fear, but also a hint of blame and a question. Are you one of us, Henson? Or are you just another tool he uses? Josiah's breath caught. He thought about Charlotte, her soft smile, and the way her hand felt warm in his. He thought about his kids, their laughter, and how they trust people without thinking. He thought about his dad and his ear, cut off, and his spirit broken. He thought of his mother and how sad she was. He thought about the fragile, shaky safety he had made for his family, which could be broken at any moment. Right away, he lifted the whip. The air was tense. Esther let out a small cry that was choked. Josiah's arm, which is usually so steady, felt heavy. Lean, he brought. The whip came down, but not with the full force Riley had expected. Instead, it came down with a controlled, painful accuracy. The first hit Daniel's back with a sharp, stinging crack that made him gasp, but not a shout. Josiah kept going, each stroke a planned torture meant to. Cause pain without hurting anyone for good, leaving welts that would heal but scars that would warn others. He counted the blows, his mind a blur, and the sound of the whip made his ears ring, and the screams of his own conscience that he couldn't hear. He saw the other slaves flinch with every blow, there, eyes wide with fear. He saw Esther put her face in Jacob's blanket. He looked at. Daniel's body shook, but his eyes still had that glimmer of defiance, even though they were full of pain. Question. Josiah's hands were shaking uncontrollably when it was over. The whip felt like a living thing, throbbing with the pain it had caused. He looked at the other two, Caleb and Samuel, and he did the same awful thing over and over, his movements stiff and his soul recoiling with each swing. He left them bleeding, but alive, with their spirits hurt but not broken. He left Esther crying, her hopes dashed. He went away from the Miller farm. He had the taste of ash in his mouth, the smell of fear on his clothes, and the cold knowledge that he had. Just gave up a part of his soul to save his own. The trip back to the Riley plantation was a blur. The whip, now stained with the blood of his brothers, it lay coiled next to him, a horrible sign of his compromise. He told himself over and over that he had done what he had to do, a desperate mantra against the guilt that was growing. He had kept his family safe. He had made sure they would live for now. But what does it cost? The look in Daniel's eyes, those accusing, questioning eyes, would always be in his mind, a silent condemnation that no amount of self-justification could erase. The dark. The event was over, but its shadow would hang over Josiah Henson's life for a long time. The event. With Daniel, Caleb, and Samuel, it became a festering wound in Josiah's soul. A constant throbbing pain under the surface of his carefully built calm, the whip in his memory, the sound of its crack, the sight of Daniel flinching back, and the feel of it in his hand played over and over in his head. His mind with painful clarity, especially in the quiet, stifling night's darkness. He often woke up in a cold sweat, the imaginary weight of the whip was still in his hand, and the people he had punished were still accusing him in his head. He made an effort to make sense of it, to bury it under layers of need and self-preservation, but the guilt was a persistent, insidious poison that slowly ate away at his sense of self. The way they interacted with the other enslaved people changed in small but permanent ways. Some, like Martha, an old woman who would turn away when he came near, and their silence was a louder condemnation than any words, than anything else that was said. Some, especially the younger men, would look at him with a mix of anger and grudging respect, knowing how hard it was for him but not being able to forgive him for the decisions he made. He heard whispers and bits of conversations that stopped suddenly when he came close. He is the master's man. If Riley told him to, he'd beat his own mother, too. Even though these words weren't said to his face, they hurt him more than any lash. He felt a deep, cold loneliness, as if a chasm were opening up between him and the community he said he was a part of. He was an outsider, even to his own. But strangely, Riley's trust in Josiah grew. The master saw the incident showed that Josiah was loyal, effective, and willing to do what was needed, what needed to be done. Henson, Riley would say, with a hint of satisfaction in his eyes. You know how to keep things in order. You are a valuable person, Hennon, a man who is really worth something. This praise that was supposed to be a reward felt like another one. Turn of the screw, making his moral compromise even stronger. Riley started to depend on him more, giving him more responsibilities like taking care of the crops, the animals, and even handling little amounts of money in the local market. Josiah became necessary, it scared him and gave him strength. The more he needed, the more he became. He felt like he was stuck. His golden cage was getting more and more beautiful, but it was still too small. His only comfort, his rock in the stormy sea of his life, was his family. Charlotte, his loyal wife, had a quiet strength that both grounded him and made him feel bad. She could see the pain in his eyes and the lines of worry on his face, around his mouth. Even though she never asked him directly about what he did, she always understood. Reminder of the things he gave up for them. Tom, Peter, and Isaac are their kids. His whole world was Rebecca, Mary, and Sarah. Their innocent faces and laughter, their little hands reaching for his, were what kept him going. A reason for every painful choice. He would watch them sleep there. His chest would rise and fall in a calm rhythm, and a strong, protective love would wash over him for a moment, taking away the guilt. He would do anything to keep them safe, even if it meant spare them the terrible things he had to go through. But this strong love also turned into his biggest flaw, the lever that Riley used to control him without him knowing. During this time, the economics of slavery in Maryland were a harsh dance of making and losing money. Tobacco was once the king. The soil was slowly running out of nutrients because of the crop, and prices were going up and down. Planters like Riley, who didn't have the money or the vision to diversify, became more and more vulnerable. Prices of land changed, and the constant threat of debt was always there. For those who were enslaved, this meant one thing. They were the most valuable asset and the most liquid form of capital. A man and a woman. A kid. Each one was a certain amount of money that could be used to pay off a debt, buy more land, or just to keep the master going. The fear of being sold south to the brutal cotton and sugar plantations in Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana was always there. Plantations in Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana were always a scary place. Many people thought of Spectre as a fate worse than death because it meant almost certain separation from family and a life of even more difficult times. Josiah knew this horrible truth better than anyone else. He looked at the ledgers. He heard Riley's worried talks with people he owes money to. He saw the desperate things other planters did. He was aware, with a cold sense of certainty, that their weak lives on the Riley plantation were always one bad crop, one failed investment, or one growing dead away from complete failure. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror of Josiah's impossible choice gets worse. The weight of his choices and the silent screams of his conscience are about to be put to the test in ways he could never have imagined. Please like this video and share it with others if you're interested in this dark part of history. Someone who likes a really creepy story, and leave a comment with your thoughts on the moral tightrope. Josiah is on his way. Your involvement drives our trip into the past. The year 1825. It changed the air in Maryland, not just the temperature but also the very fabric of the Riley plantations. Life. Riley's money problems, which used to be a constant hum, had grown into a roar that was deafening. His land, which had been used for growing tobacco for years, was now empty. Less and less. His investments, which were always risky, had gone bad. The people who owe money were once patient, but now they were circling like vultures. Josiah, who had heard Riley's increasingly desperate talks and the grim numbers in his books, he felt the noose of disaster tightening around him. He knew with a cold heart, sure that a big change was about to happen. On a hot afternoon, Riley called Josiah to the main house. The master's face was drawn, and his eyes were bloodshot, but he spoke in a forced, cheerful tone that, right away, made Josiah nervous. "Hey, Henson," Riley said, pointing to Josiah. "Stand in front of his desk. I have made a choice, a big choice, one that will help us all. Maryland, my friend, is no longer the land of opportunity it used to be. The soil is. The markets are unpredictable. But Kentucky, oh Kentucky, a land of fertile ground, of new starts, of wealth. Josiah listened with his heart. He knew the rhetoric. Every word made him feel worse. For the master, new beginnings often meant more suffering for the enslaved. Riley went on to explain his plan. He would move all of his property, his slaves, the rest of his animals, and the few tools he could save to a new farm in Kentucky, near the town of Daviess County. He painted a vivid picture of a promised land where the work would be easier. There would be more food, and families would stay together. "No more sales, Henson," Riley said, his voice booming with fake sincerity. "We will build a new life together, a community." There was a family in Kentucky. Then came the news that both raised Josiah and sent him into a deeper abyss of moral torment. "And you, Henson," Riley said, his eyes gleaming with what Josiah now saw as manipulative trust. "You will lead them. You are the person I trust the most, my boss. You will take the whole company, men, women, kids, and animals on the trip. You will help them get to Kentucky safely. I'll follow later when I have taken care of my business here. Henson, you will be in charge. You are in charge of all of their lives." Josiah's head was spinning. To be given such a big job to lead his, it was an honor to lead people to what was promised as a better life. But the forced. Riley's cheerful voice and the too eager promises grated on Josiah's nerves. Very sharp instincts for lying. He had seen too many promises not kept too, many dreams broken. Josiah couldn't sleep that night, so he walked around the small space in his cabin. The weight of the journey ahead and the lives he was responsible for weighed heavily on him. He thought about Charlotte and how quiet she was. Optimism, her desire for a better future for their kids. He thought of the other people who were enslaved, their faces, light with a weak hope, holding on to what Riley said. He had to know what was true. A few days later, he got his chance. Riley was in a hurry to get ready for his. Had left his desk in a mess before he left. A pile of papers, most of the time. Carefully protected, lay open. Josiah with his secretly gotten. Literacy had a strong pull on him. His heart raced against his ribs as he slipped into the main house as the sun was going down. He moved like a shadow, making no noise. His eyes looked over the papers, promissory notes, bills of sale, and letters. From people who owe money. Then he saw it. A letter to a Mr. Marks in Daviess County in the state of Kentucky. Josiah's breath caught in his throat as he read the scary words. His eyes darted around. The page. Every word was like a hammer blow to his soul. The letter made it clear what Riley really wanted. The move to Kentucky wasn't for a fresh start. It was a strategic move. The rich soil of Kentucky was only a temporary place to stay. The real plan was to sell most of the enslaved people, even whole families, to the highest bidder in the busy slave markets of the Deep South, using the money to pay off Riley's huge debts. Money owed. The promise to keep families together was a cruel, planned lie. The new life was a euphemism for spreading out, for the final, brutal break. Josiah's hands shook so. He shook it so hard that he almost dropped the letter. The words swam in front of his eyes, one by one. A burning brand. He wasn't leading his people to freedom, or even to a little bit of it. Better slavery. He was taking them to the auction block, to the slaughter, to a fate much worse than anything they had already been through. He was going to be the shepherd who led his flock to the wolf without knowing it. It felt like a punch to the gut when he realized it. Josiah Henson, the man who had made painful compromises to protect his family and was now a trusted overseer, was now an accomplice in the worst betrayal. He was going to give his own people to the people who were going to kill them. The psychological torture was instant and complete. He had to keep up the act of loyalty, to lead them with a convincing air of hope, all while knowing the horrible truth. His brain raced to find a solution in a hurry. Should he tell Riley, but how? And what would happen as a result? Riley's wrath would be quick and deadly not just for him, but also for Charlotte and their kids, who would probably be sold. First, and to the worst master, if he tries to run away with his family, it was tempting to think about. A siren song of self-preservation, but he could see the faces of the others, their trusting eyes flashing in front of him. He had showed them the way. He had punished them. In his own sick way, he had kept them safe. Could he now leave them to such a fate? A fate? This secret, this awful knowledge felt like a shroud over him. He was stuck, caught, between the devil of his master's lies and the deep blue sea of his own conscience. He had to make plans for Anne, escape for his family and as many other people as he could, all while playing the role of the faithful, optimistic leader. Once a vague promise, the trip to Kentucky now looked like a dangerous path. Every step was dangerous, and every mile was a proof of his painful choice. The preparations for the trip once filled the enslaved with false hope, and now it felt like the careful planning of a mass. Josiah was the unwilling high priest for the sacrifice. He saw the others pack. Their few things, their faces lit up with the fragile hope, and the lie he had to live became a heavy load that was suffocating him, a secret that could have eaten him alive. The trip started in the late fall of 1825, a line of people in pain and false hope moving west from Maryland. Josiah, a strong horse, led the caravan of wagons loaded with goods. With few belongings, and the long line of enslaved men, women, and children shuffling along, and kids, their faces showing a mix of tiredness and a fragile, desperate hope. The air was fresh, with the smell of burning leaves and the distant promise of winter. But for Josiah, it was full of the heavy weight of his secret. He was their leader, their protector, and their leader who could be trusted. But he knew he was taking them to the edge of a cliff. The path was long and hard, cutting through the rough ground of western Maryland, over the Allegheny Mountains, and into the hills of Kentucky. Every day was a test of endurance as they marched on and on under Josiah's watchful eye, who had to keep the illusion of having control and a goal. He had to keep pushing them to keep them moving so they would get to their destination on time. Schedule. All the while his mind raced, desperately looking for a way to stop the disaster that was about to happen. The days turned into a boring pattern of travel. Dawn. The mist clung to the trees like ghostly shrouds as the cold mountain air broke. Josiah would wake up his voice firm but not harsh, telling the group to break camp. The carts. The animals were loaded. The creaking and groaning of the carts and the shuffling of the enslaved people made clouds of dust that left a thin, gritty layer on everything. They ate small amounts of cornmeal and salted pork that had been cooked over, open fires that made their eyes hurt from the smoke. We spent the nights huddled together for warmth under the vast, uncaring, a sky full of stars. The sounds of the wild are always there, making me uneasy. They ran into other travelers, white settlers going west, their faces full of a similar, if less desperate, hope. Groups of slave catchers, their eyes sharp and predatory, looking over Josiah's papers with suspicion. And then a small group of Native Americans who were quiet and watched. Presence, a harsh reminder of another group of people who had lost everything, every time we met. For Josiah, it was a moment of high tension, a near miss when his carefully could fall apart if the facade was built wrong. He had to be careful when he answered questions with. He was able to easily present himself as the loyal, efficient overseer while. His heart pounded against his ribs. One thing that happened stuck in his mind. Into Josiah's mind. The path was narrow and they were far up in the mountains. Dangerous. A young woman named Ruth fell down when she was tired and sick. A small, crying baby lay next to her. The group lost its way. They stopped making progress. Josiah knew they couldn't afford to wait. Riley's directions were clear. Keep up the pace. Don't draw attention to yourself. He also knew that if he left Ruth behind, he would die or be caught. He glanced at the looks on the other people's faces, their pleading eyes, and their fear were clear. He thought of Charlotte and his own kids. He chose what to do. He told Jacob and 2 other strong men to make a litter. Daniel, a younger, quieter man than the one from the earlier incident, to make a makeshift litter. He helped carry Ruth and her child himself, which slowed them down, put Riley's anger at risk, but he couldn't leave them behind. Them. Even though it was small, the act was a quiet rebellion, proof that he was still human. Defiance of the cold logic of his master's orders. Some people were quietly grateful to him for it, and others were more trusting of him. Trust that was weak from others. But the mental pain of his secret never stopped. He would watch the kids play and hear their innocent laughter echoing through He would feel sick as he looked at the valleys. He would pay attention to the grown-ups, talk about their hopes for Kentucky, their plans for a small garden, and a little bit. Better cabin, and he would have to force a smile to say something nice, even though he knew the truth was bitter. It felt like a ghost, moving among the living, aware of a horror they couldn't yet see. He often found himself. He sat by the campfire at night, staring at the flickering flames and thinking about what Riley had said in her letter, looking for a way out, a loophole. He thought about running away with his family many times. He knew where they came from. He had the right skills, but every time the faces of the other people, their trusting eyes held him back. He had gotten them this far. Could he really leave them to there? What will happen? The weight of his perceived leadership, the duty he had reluctantly taken on, now held him back even more tightly than any chain could. He was taking them to their deaths, and the knowledge was always there, suffocating him, like a silent scream stuck in his chest. The trip, which lasted for weeks and was like a crucible, strengthening Josiah's resolve even as it broke his heart. He learned to lie with conviction and give off an air of unwavering loyalty to Riley, even though he was secretly plotting. Defiance. He learned how to read the small signs of danger and how to get around the dangerous world of people. Doubt. He was a man torn in two, leading a doomed march, and the weight of that duality threatened to crush him more and more with each mile. The arrival in Daviess County, Kentucky was met with a mix of tiredness and careful hope. The new farm, though. It was smaller and less well-known than Riley's estate in Maryland, but it gave him a break from the constant trip the tired but hopeful slaves started the hard work of. They cleared land, built cabins, and planted crops, all while feeling hopeful about the future. "Hey, Josie!" But they only saw the grim truth behind the facade. Yes, the land was. The land was good, but the master's absence, which was caused by his business in Maryland, was a big red flag. Riley had sent that Mr. Finch, a local agent, was in charge of the first operations. Finch. He was a cold, calculating man with no warmth in his eyes and short, sharp words. Exact. He had a grudging respect for Josiah, recognizing how well he did his job, but there was an underlying. A current of doubt ran through his behavior. Josiah, always on the lookout, saw the small signs. Finch often talked quietly with local traders, which made it seem like. The way he would look at the enslaved people with a cold, judging look, as if he were figuring out how much they were worth on the market. There was more and more proof of betrayal, little hints that slowly chipped away at the weak hope of the other people. The new tools that were promised never came. The quality of their rations, which were better at first, quickly got worse. Finch started to do the most damning thing, checking on the slaves, lining them up, looking at their teeth, muscles, and overall health. He would write down notes in a small leather-bound ledger, just like a buyer would look at livestock. As Josiah watched these scary rituals, he felt a cold scratch on his back. He felt a sense of dread. He understood what these checks meant. He tried. Find a way to prove his fears, to get proof that couldn't be denied. One night, he pretended to be sick so he could get into Finch's temporary office in the main cabin. His heart pounded against his ribs as he went through the papers, looking for anything that would back up what the letter said. Reed in Maryland. He found it. A series of letters between Finch and Riley told the plan to sell off the extra stock, a scary way to say, people to buyers in New Orleans and Natchez. The letters even had a first draft, a list of names. When Josiah saw names he knew, his blood ran cold. Names of families he had taken over mountains and rivers. People who trusted him gave him their names. The names of his own family were not on the first list. A small, scary mercy, but he knew it was only a matter of time. Riley's debts were worse than he thought, and selling a few wouldn't be enough. The knowledge was too much to bear. He was lying about his life, leading his people to their deaths. And the clock was running out. He needed to do something. But how? If you confront Finch directly, it would be like killing yourself, which would lead to his immediate sale and probably his family's as well. He had to keep up his act, too. Keep acting like the loyal overseer. Even though his souls were screaming in protest, the stress on the farm became clear. The enslaved people, who still didn't know the full extent of Riley's betrayal, he felt the change in the air. Their first hope started to turn into unease. People started to talk about the market and the South, quiet and scared. Josiah would see their eyes full of unspoken words, questions, and he would have to force a smile that made him feel better, even though it tasted like ash in his mouth. One afternoon, a group of traders came, their faces stern and their eyes sharp. They spent hours with Finch going over the ledger and looking out at the fields where the slaves were working. People worked hard. Josiah watched from a distance, his muscles tight and his mind running. He saw Finch point to a young mother named Abigail and her two smallest kids. Abigail, a kind person, had been one of the most hopeful people on the trip. Josiah felt a rush of protective anger and a strong desire to step in, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. He had to wait, plan, and look for the right time. The masters. Weeks later, the arrival brought no relief. Riley was even more tired and worn out. The forced cheerfulness is gone, and in its place is a grim, desperate resolve. He quickly started meeting with Finch and the traders. Their talks were private, and their voices were low, quiet, and secretive. People often called Josiah, the trusted overseer, to help. For small jobs, which let him hear bits of their conversations, he heard prices, dates, and places. The sale was about to happen. It wasn't a sudden revelation for Josiah that he had to make a choice. It was a slow, painful process. Crystallization of fear. He saw the traders looking at his own kids, measuring their small bodies, and assessed for health. He saw the fear in Charlotte's eyes and heard her silent plea. He was aware. Then he knew for sure that he couldn't save everyone. He couldn't fight the system by himself. He couldn't expose Riley without putting his own family in danger of the same thing he was trying to stop. His choice, which was hard, and it became clear that it was soul-crushing. He had to put his family's escape first. He had to protect Charlotte and their kids, even if it meant leaving others behind to deal with the horrors of the auction. Block. This choice had a huge moral weight. It would be a secret he would carry with him for the rest of his life. To his death. The growing evidence of betrayal and the gathering of clues had pushed him to this breaking point and made him choose something that no man should ever have to do. The end came with the harsh sound of a gavel hitting an auction block. It was a cold, gray morning in late autumn, and the air was thick with the promise of an early winter. Riley, his face a mask of grim, gathered the slaves in the main yard with determination. His voice, which was usually loud, was now short and, without its usual fake happiness. "I regret to tell you," he started, his eyes looking away from the faces in front of me, "I have to do this because of things that came up that I didn't expect. Make some tough choices. Some of you will be moving on to new things." The euphemism hung in the air, cruelly mocking their hopes. Josiah watched. His heart felt like a heavy weight in his chest as the traders, the same men he had seen days earlier, stepped forward. They started to call out names. The first was Abigail, the young mother Josiah had seen them check her out. Her eyes, which were wide with fear, darted to her two small kids, holding on to her skirts. A trader roughly pulled Abigail away from them, and a wagon was waiting for her, and her kids were screaming and reaching out for her. The sound of their cries, raw and primal, tore through the sound of the yard, which would haunt Josiah's dreams for years to come. Then came the name of Jacob, the strong young man who had helped Ruth carry her on the journey. He was taken away from his wife. Esther fell to the ground, and her silent sobs shook her whole body. Families were broken one by one, and lives were changed forever. The air was full of. Josiah stood among them, hearing the sounds of crying, desperate pleas, and the cold indifference of the traders. His face was blank and his body was stiff. He was the overseer, the man they trusted. He had to keep up the act, but inside he was going through a storm. He saw the faces of those he had led, and now their eyes were filled with crushing despair. Some of them turned to him. Their silent questions were a harsh accusation. He saw the fear in Charlotte's eyes. Her hand instinctively reached for their kids and pulled them closer. He knew for sure that his family would be next, and it made him shiver. Riley's debts were too big, and his. Too much desperation. Abigail's kids, with their little hands reaching for their mother as she was. The last painful thing that happened was when he was dragged away. It was like a mirror showing his own greatest fear. He couldn't let that happen to Charlotte, and he wouldn't let it happen. And their kids. The choice, which had once been a theoretical nightmare, was now a harsh, brutal reality. He would save his family. He would get away, and he would do it tonight. Once he made up his mind, brought with it a grim, cold clarity. He moved with a new sense of purpose, his mind. He was racing and carefully planning every detail. He had seen how the farm was set up, and how the few people who lived there went about their daily lives, the last white overseers, and the paths through the wild areas around him. He He knew the phases of the moon and the direction of the North Star. He looked for Charlotte. His eyes said how important his message was without him saying a word. In the privacy of their cabin, he whispered his plan, his voice low and steady, hiding the tremor in his heart. Charlotte nodded, her face pale but determined. She knew what was at stake. Would take their 6 kids and leave behind everything they owned, and knew to dive into the scary, unknown. They spent the day in a blur of forced normalcy, moving in a precise way. Their faces were carefully blank. Josiah quietly gathered what little food he could find, which was a small bag of cornmeal, some dried meat, and a few hard biscuits. Charlotte made small pouches to hold them. For the kids to carry their few things, like a few precious trinkets and a worn blanket. They talked in low voices. Their kids were unusually quiet because they knew how serious the situation was. Their big eyes looked at their parents with both fear and trust. As dusk fell, and long, creepy shadows fell over the farm, the sounds of the crying of the families that had been separated could still be heard faintly in the distance, a haunting reminder of what was going to happen to them, desperately trying to get away. Josiah waited until the overseer's fire had burned out completely before. The sounds of the farm had settled down to the steady chirping of crickets and the hooting of an owl in the distance. It was dark and thick, with no moon. It was both a blessing and a curse. Josiah led his. The family came out of their cabin, moving painfully slowly. Every time the leaves rustled under their feet, which sounded like a thunderclap. He held the youngest child, Sarah, in his arms. Charlotte held Mary's hand and felt her body against his chest, warm and fragile. Leading the other kids, who were so small that they were hard to see in the dark. They moved like ghosts, going around thee. They walked quietly along the edge of the fields, their bare feet making no noise on the wet ground. Every shadow seemed to be hiding a threat. Every bark from a dog far away made me jump with fear, through Josiah's veins. He remembered the stories of slave catchers and how they bloodhounds and their never-ending chase. He remembered how scared he was of being caught again. Harsh punishments awaited anyone who tried to escape. As they got closer to the edge of the woods, a twig snapped loudly behind them. Josiah froze, and his heart raced. He turned around, straining his eyes into the dark, and instinctively reached for a rough knife he had hidden in his belt. Nothing, just the sound of leaves moving in. The wind, which was a false alarm but a strong reminder of how dangerous it always is. They plunged into the thick woods, where the trees closed around them like a protective but threatening hug. The darkness here was complete, except for the faint shimmering light of the distant stars that came through the canopy. Josiah relied on his deep knowledge of the wilderness. His senses were heightened, and he led them by the feel of the land, the slight change in the wind, and the faint smell of pine. Even though they were tired and scared, the children moved with amazing quietness. Charlotte's small hands clung to her parents' hands, and she trusted them completely. In the dark, her face was a pale blur. She moved with quiet determination, her eyes, a silent pillar of strength, fixed on Josiah. As they moved further away, the sounds of people in pain faded as they got farther away from the farm and were replaced by the symphony of the night forest. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was full of unspoken fears, hopes that were desperate, and the heavy burden of the choices Josiah had made. Leading his family to an unknown freedom, while leaving behind a community he had, in his own way, betrayed. That night, they didn't just run away from their captivity. They also ran away from the moral wreckage of his past, a frantic race to stay alive that would always leave him with a bitter taste of guilt. The escape itself was a blur of basic fear and desperate endurance. For weeks, Josiah and his family moved in the dark, following the North Star and the faint whispers of directions. They traveled through thick forests and across frozen rivers on the secret network of the Underground Railroad, and over dangerous mountains. Their bodies hurt and their stomachs were growling. With hunger, their spirits kept up only by the strong, unwavering hope for freedom. Every rustle of the leaves, every bark of a dog in the distance, and every shadow that. When the moonlight hit them, they danced, and Josiah felt a rush of fear. He carried the youngest kids when there. His small legs gave out, and his strong body was straining under the weight. His mind was always on guard, and Charlotte, a quiet source of strength, kept the older kids moving with her eyes. Focused on Josiah, her faith in him never wavered. As they traveled north, the faces of those who stayed behind in Kentucky haunted Josiah's waking hours and invaded his. He couldn't sleep well. He saw Abigail's kids screaming and reaching for their mother. Jacob saw Esther's broken face as he was, pulled away. He saw Daniel's accusing eyes and the silent question in his. The weight of their suffering, the betrayal, and the knowledge of the fate he had given them all pressed down on him. He had saved his family, yes, but the weight was so heavy that even the crisp, free air of the North could not lift it. But what did it cost his soul? Was he a hero for giving them their freedom, or he couldn't stop thinking about it? Was he a coward for leaving his brothers behind? Torment. After weeks of terrible travel, they finally crossed the border into Canada. It was not a happy celebration, but a deep, tired relief that was tinged with a deep, widespread sadness. The air felt different, lighter. But he was free, but the psychological chains of his past still held him back. He was marked by the scars of slavery and the deeper wounds of his moral compromises. Josiah and his family started the hard work of building a new life in Canada. He worked hard to clear land, build a cabin, and set up a community for other fugitives. He became a respected leader and a source of hope for those who took the same dangerous path to freedom. But even though he worked hard and the number of people who wanted to help him grew, the ghosts of Kentucky stayed in the community. Years later, a chance meeting confirmed his worst fears in a terrifying way. A man named Caleb, not the same Caleb from the Maryland case, but a younger man who had been on the farm in Kentucky, recognized Josiah. Their reunion was short and full of unspoken tension. Caleb told the terrible things that happened after Josiah escaped, his eyes empty. Riley was so angry at what he thought was Josiah's betrayal that he really did sell off the rest of the enslaved people, including many of the families Josiah had led from Maryland to the brutal markets of the Abigail's kids had been sold separately in the Deep South. Esther was heartbroken by Jacob's sale had made him lose hope. The news confirmed what Josiah had been saying. Worst nightmares. A brutal confirmation of his painful choice, and a new wave of guilt washed over him, threatening to drown him in its depths. He had saved his own, but at the cost of so many others. His actions were still morally complex, even though he family's freedom. It was a constant, nagging question that would grow louder. Forever define his legacy. Josiah Henson's life in Canada became a testament to resilience and an unwavering dedication to helping others find the freedom he had been looking for so long. He started the Dawn. Settlement was a busy place for runaway slaves to live in Dresden, Ontario, where he worked hard to provide. He provided education, vocational training, and a safe place for people who were fleeing the harsh realities of American slavery. traveled a lot and spoke out against the wrongs of slavery. His strong voice could be heard an abolitionist. He became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, personally leading people to safety in circles all over North America and even in England. Scores of men, women, and children to freedom. He knew the escape routes inside and out and was always brave, making him a famous person among the enslaved. In 1849, at the urging of Ed, Josiah wrote his autobiography, The Life of Josiah, with the help of his abolitionist friends. Henson, who used to be a slave and now lives in Canada, as told by. It was a powerful and moving story of his journey from slavery to freedom, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure, the spirit's ability to last. But as he told his story, Josiah made a painful, conscious choice. He cleaned up some areas. He carefully left out the darkest and most morally gray parts of his life. He talked about his job as an overseer, but he downplayed the harsh realities of the job, like the times he had to use the whip and the accusations that were made against him without saying anything. He talked about the trip to Kentucky, but he also talked about how scary it was to find out what Riley really wanted. His plans, the painful choice to put his family's escape first, and the secret knowledge of betrayal he held, over warning the others. He told a story of pain and eventual victory, a story meant to inspire, too, gain support for the abolitionist cause and maybe even protect himself from the terrible guilt that still gnawed at him. He made a version of himself that was tasty, heroic, and simple. A version that could stand for a bigger cause. This was a sanitized story that eventually got into Harriet Beecher Stowe's hands. Henson's story deeply moved her. Stowe drew heavily on his life for inspiration, especially his trip to Kentucky and his eventual escape. For her first anti-slavery book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which came out in 1852, she turned Josiah Henson, a complicated man with a troubled conscience, into the Uncle Tom is a fictional character who is always pious and passive. Endurance and eventual martyrdom. The irony was deep for Josiah. Very disturbing. He was a man who had used the whip and had made choices that were impossible, had carried the heavy weight of a terrible secret, and was now remembered as the kind and obedient Uncle Tom. The public liked this simple version, an idealized version of a Christian's suffering that struck a chord with the moral values of the time. But the real Josiah Henson, the man who lived, the man who knew the bitter taste of compromise and lived with the ghosts of Kentucky, was mostly unknown. His real story is buried under layers of literary and historical analysis. Convenience. Even in his later years when he was still working and getting praise for his. Despite his work for the abolitionist movement, the shadow of his past never fully left him. He carried the weight of his decisions, the silent screams of those he had left behind, and the knowledge of the darker truths he had never fully revealed. Maybe in his private moments, when he was alone in his. He thought about those painful choices again and again in his cabin, when he had to choose between saving his family and saving other people's lives. Maybe he thought about what he could have done more, if there was a different way he could have gone. There are no definitive smoking gun documents that clearly show Josiah's internal pain or his full knowledge. Of Riley's betrayal have come to light. The historical record provides intriguing hints. The overseer's role was very different from what he said in public, which was very different from what it really was. The documented financial desperation of Isaac Riley and the established practices of selling enslaved individuals from Maryland to the Deep South, all of these things point to a life that is much more complicated and morally difficult than the one he wrote about in his autobiography. The act of cleaning up his story, A common thing that former slaves did to make the abolitionist cause seem heroic says a lot about the things they didn't say. Josiah Henson was not just a victim. He was a survivor who had to make impossible choices in an impossible system. A man whose real legacy is not the simple picture of Uncle Tom, but in the chilling, unexamined depths of his moral courage and his lasting, hidden guilt. If Josiah Henson's terrifying journey and the disturbing, if the moral problems in his life have made you question the stories we usually believe, then you're right. You need to be here. Don't forget to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more in-depth looks at the hidden parts of. What do you think about the impossible choices Josiah had to make? Do you think of him as a hero, a survivor, or something much less clear? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep working to figure out the unsettling truths that are hidden below the surface of our